What if the man your daughter was about to marry looked you in the eye and said, "You don't belong at her wedding"? That's not a nightmare. It happened to me. My name is Martin Alvarez, and 3 decades of sweat, brick, and late nights meant nothing the moment my future son-in-law decided to draw a line between important people and the rest of us. This isn't just a wedding story, it's a family drama. It's pro-revenge. It's a cautionary tale about how quickly respect can vanish when pride and privilege collide. It started in my own living room the Thursday before the rehearsal dinner. Nathaniel Nate Whitaker, Yale graduate investment banker, proud son of Westchester old money, leaned back in his tailored suit and with the kind of confidence only inherited wealth can buy dropped 11 words that burn themselves into my memory. "We only want important people at our wedding. Martin, not your immigrant friends." He thought he was being diplomatic, just managing optics, as he called it. But make no mistake, those words weren't about logistics. They were about erasing everything I had built. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, the same calm smile my crews know from construction sites when someone's about to learn a very expensive lesson. And then came the final slap in the face, the seating chart. After 30 years of building shopping centers, office towers, and luxury homes across 3 states, I was assigned to table 12, tucked in the back corner by the kitchen doors. Not next to my daughter, not near family, but right where the waiters would be rushing plates in and out, like I was baggage too heavy for the front row. That moment planted a seed of quiet fury. Family drama doesn't always explode in screaming matches. Sometimes it simmers in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to turn. I had spent my life being underestimated, first as a broke immigrant, laying bricks in 100-degree heat, later as a contractor people assumed just got lucky. But luck doesn't build a company worth $120 million. Luck doesn't finish 847 projects. Luck doesn't employ 340 men and women who call me boss, and more importantly, call me brother. While Nate Whitaker spoke of refined money and social optics, I was taking mental notes. This wasn't just arrogance. This was the kind of arrogance that blinds a man to the trap he's already stepped into. He thought I was just Sophia's father, a construction worker to be tolerated until the champagne popped. What he didn't realize was that this wedding would soon become a battlefield, and I wasn't the one about to lose. So lean in, because the next few minutes will show you how a single phrase, important people, can destroy reputations, rip apart families, and trigger the kind of justice-served story that makes headlines and shatters illusions. This is Table 12. This is where the uninvited fight back. They say betrayal never comes from enemies, it comes from the people you let closest. For me, it didn't arrive as a knife in the dark. It arrived one cross-out at a time, one seating chart revision after another, one polite suggestion that chipped away at my life until I was almost erased from my own daughter's wedding. At first, it was subtle. Back in March, when the early planning began, I handed my daughter Sophia a list of 27 names. It wasn't a list of CEOs, senators, or hedge fund managers. It was a list of men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me through the hardest years of my life. Guys who had carried lumber when my hands blistered, who stayed on site until midnight, pouring concrete before the frost could set, who called me boss, but treated me like brother. Tony Ramirez, the foreman, who taught me how to read blueprints when my English was broken. Mike Sullivan, the loan officer who put his reputation on the line to vouch for an immigrant no bank would touch. Mrs. Delgado, the babysitter who practically raised Sophia while I worked double shifts. These weren't just names. They were the backbone of everything I had built. When Sophia first saw the list, she smiled, even laughed. Of course, Dad, they're family. But that smile faded when Nate put his arm around her shoulders. He scanned the paper like it was a grocery list with items that didn't belong in his cart. Then came the first cut. "Maybe we should reconsider some of these invitations," he said in that casual, polite tone people use right before they slap you across the face. The Whitaker family has certain expectations. I caught the way Sophia shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. She wanted to protest, but she didn't. Love makes you quiet sometimes. Love makes you compromise. And in that silence, my list shrank. By April, my construction crew was gone. My poker buddies from the old neighborhood, men who had stood by me when I had nothing erased. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor who watched Sophia grow up while I hammered nails at dawn, was deemed too informal for a Whitaker wedding. The excuse was always the same: optics. Optics. That word became a curse in my head. Every time Nate said it, what he really meant was, we need people who look like us, not people who look like you. By May, the betrayal deepened. Nate sat across my kitchen table with a stack of glossy brochures. Dad, he said he never called me Martin always. Dad, like the word itself, gave him ownership. You'll be meeting some very important people. Judges, partners from my father's firm old families. First impressions matter. He slid a business card across the table. His family's tailor. The message was clear. My clothes, my history, my identity weren't good enough. Dress like us, talk like us, sit where we tell you, and maybe we'll let you belong. June brought the deepest cut yet. We visited Westchester Country Club for a walkthrough. I had paid the $500 deposit myself, money I earned laying brick in 100-degree heat, while Nate was swinging lacrosse sticks at prep school. When the planner asked who I was, Nate didn't say, "This is Sophia's father." He said, "This is Martin. He's in construction." The way he said it, like I laid sewer pipes instead of building the luxury homes his friends lived in. What he didn't know was that in 2019, my company Alvarez Construction had renovated that entire East Wing for $2 million. I knew every board member by name. I had their personal cell numbers, but I stayed silent. Sometimes silence is sharper than any insult. By July, the pattern was clear. This wasn't about streamlining a guest list. This was about systematically erasing my life from Sophia's wedding. My business associates out. My church friends might not understand the social dynamics. Even my own brother Carlos, a cardiologist who had been saving lives for 2 decades, was questioned. "Is he established in the community?" Nate asked. Established, as if saving human hearts wasn't enough to earn a seat at his table. The final insult came 3 weeks before the wedding. Nate arrived at my house with revised seating charts. I scanned the paper and saw my name in black ink. Table 12, back corner, next to the kitchen doors. Elena's mother, God rest her soul, would have been mortified, I thought. Her picture sat on the mantel as I held that paper. She had sacrificed everything so Sophia could grow up with choices we never had. And now her daughter's fiancé was treating me like an inconvenience to be managed. "It's just logistics," Martin Nate said, not even meeting my eyes. "The front tables are for immediate family and key business contacts." Key business contacts. That phrase echoed in my skull like a gunshot. I had built a $120 million company from nothing. Alvarez Construction had completed 847 projects across 3 states, employed 340 people, built shopping centers, hotels, office towers. And yet in Nate's eyes, I wasn't a key contact. I was baggage. That was the moment betrayal stopped being personal and started becoming strategic. I looked at my daughter's graduation photo on the wall, valedictorian cap and gown, the first Alvarez to walk across a stage that big. I had worked myself to the bone to pay for that diploma, but she was about to marry a man who believed her father belonged in the shadows in the corner by the kitchen doors. It was more than insult. It was erasure. And I knew then that if I stayed silent, Nate would not only erase me, he would erase Sophia's roots, her history, her pride in where she came from. He would teach her to be ashamed of the very thing that made her extraordinary. So I smiled, folded the seating chart, and said nothing. Betrayal has a way of sharpening your resolve. He thought he was writing me out of the story. He didn't realize he was giving me the opening lines of a new chapter 1, where family drama turns into justice served, and the important people finally learn what real importance looks like. Some betrayals are loud slam doors, raised voices, public humiliation. But the Whitakers' betrayal was quieter, dressed up in pearls and polite smiles, slipped into conversations like sugar packets hiding poison. It wasn't the things they screamed. It was the things they whispered with a smile on their faces that cut the deepest. Evelyn Whitaker, Nate's mother, had a way of speaking that wrapped condescension in velvet. She never once raised her voice to me. She didn't need to. Every sentence came dipped in politeness, yet the sting lingered long after. At first, she seemed welcoming. "Martin, we're so lucky Sophia found Nathaniel," she said the first night I joined them for dinner at their sprawling estate. The chandelier sparkled above crystal glasses, reflected candlelight, and for a brief second I thought maybe we could find common ground. Then came the next line, soft, delicate, but cutting like a blade. "She must be so proud to be marrying into a family with deep roots here." Deep roots, the words echoed. The implication wasn't lost on me. My roots apparently didn't count. My roots were in soil from another country watered with sweat and sacrifice. Her roots and her eyes were the only ones that mattered. The Whitaker estate was like a museum of legacy portraits of ancestors in gilded frames, shelves of leather-bound books. No one read, mahogany furniture polished to perfection. Every corner whispered wealth, but not the kind you earn, the kind you inherit. To them, legacy wasn't built. It was handed down, guarded like a crown jewel. And whenever I stepped into that house, I could feel their eyes scanning me, measuring me, deciding how far short I fell of their standards. At cocktail parties leading up to the wedding, Evelyn would glide across the room in designer gowns, clutching my arm like we were the best of friends. To the casual observer, it might have looked like affection. But then she'd lean in close enough so only I could hear and say things like, "Don't worry, Martin. You don't need to worry about hosting anything too formal. We'll handle the optics." Optics again. The same cursed word Nate loved to use. It was their family language, a code for who belonged and who didn't. There was one evening in June at a pre-wedding dinner. They had invited judges' partners from Nate's father's law firm and a Senator Caldwell himself, who shook hands like he was sealing the fate of nations. I stood there in my best suit, one I had worn proudly to ribbon cuttings of skyscrapers I had built, but Evelyn still tilted her head, her smile flawless. "Martin, that's a very nice suit," she said. "Then the dagger, Nate should take you to our family's tailor. They specialize in subtle refinement." Subtle refinement. To her, my clothes screamed outsider, my handshake too firm, my accent too plain. She never said those words, but every compliment carried an aftertaste of pity. At one point, Evelyn showed me the seating chart. "Don't take this personally," she whispered. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable among your own circle." My own circle, the table near the kitchen doors. Apparently that's where men like me belong, close enough to serve, far enough to be forgotten. And yet in front of Sophia, she played the doting mother-in-law. "Darling, your father is so dedicated. Look at all he's built. We're honored to have him join our family." I watched Sophia beam with pride, not realizing her fiancé's mother had just reduced my life's work to a polite pat on the head. It was theater, a performance staged for my daughter's sake. But Evelyn wasn't alone. The entire Whitaker family moved with the same choreography, smiles in public, daggers in private. At brunch, Nate's father spoke warmly about my company, Alvarez Construction. "Impressive, Martin, really impressive," he said, swirling his wine glass. Then with a glance at Senator Caldwell, he added, "But of course you understand that society weddings are different. They require a certain touch, a certain refinement." The word again, refinement. As if my projects, my crews, the 847 buildings we'd completed weren't refined enough to count. Even Nate's younger cousins joined in, snickering about construction dust on my shoes, whispering about new money trying too hard. They didn't even realize I had chosen a modest life on purpose, driving the same pickup for years, eating in diners where the waitresses knew my name, because I never cared about optics. I cared about people, about results. But to them, my humility was just another punchline. Sophia, God bless her, tried to bridge the gap. She'd place her hand over mine at dinners. Whisper, "Don't mind them, Dad. They don't mean anything by it." But words mean everything. And every whispered insult, every kind suggestion, every backhanded compliment wasn't just about me. It was about teaching my daughter to be ashamed of where she came from. That was the true betrayal. One night, after yet another polished evening of polite humiliation, I drove home in silence. The city lights blurred through the windshield. On the passenger seat sat the seating chart they had given me to review. My name glared back at me, table 12. I thought about Sophia's mother, my late wife, whose photo still stood on our mantel. I imagined what she would have said if she had seen her husband, the man who built a company from nothing, treated like a second-class guest at his own daughter's wedding. The Whitakers thought they were being gracious. They thought they were disguising disdain as affection. But I knew better. Fake kindness cuts deeper than open cruelty. And every time they smiled at me, every time Evelyn called me dear, while moving me to the shadows, they were digging a grave for their own reputation. They believed I would stay silent forever. They believed the immigrant father would bow, accept his place at the back, and smile for the cameras. What they didn't understand was this: I was done being politely erased. Their pretense of affection had given me all the motivation I needed. The Whitakers thought optics would save them. They were about to learn optics can be shattered in one decisive moment. Silence has always been my sharpest weapon. People mistake it for weakness. But I've learned that silence can carve deeper wounds than any argument. And as the Whitakers smiled their polished smiles and drew lines between important and unimportant, I leaned into silence. But inside my mind was anything but quiet. I thought back to the boy I once was, 19 years old, stepping off a bus from El Paso with 2 duffel bags and $37 in my pocket. My English was clumsy, my hands already calloused from years of work back home. America wasn't a dream then, it was survival. I remember my first job on a construction crew in the Bronx. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, hauling bricks until my back screamed and my shoulders burned. The older men called me El Mulo the Mule because I carried twice as much as anyone else. I didn't complain. Complaints didn't pay rent. Complaints didn't buy rice and beans. Complaints didn't keep the lights on. It was on those scaffolds in the blistering sun and freezing rain that I learned 2 things. Sweat is the only language everyone respects, and silence lets you observe what others miss. I watched foremen cut corners, supervisors pocket cash, contractors overcharge clients. I learned the game not by talking, but by listening. By the time I was 25, I wasn't just carrying bricks. I was leading crews. And then came Alvarez Construction. It didn't start with an office or a polished logo. It started in my garage with a beat-up Ford pickup and a stack of Home Depot receipts. I took jobs nobody else wanted: leaky basements, rotted roofs, cracked sidewalks. I worked through holidays. I missed birthdays. My knuckles stayed split, my boots stayed muddy, and every night I collapsed onto the mattress like a man twice my age. But little by little, brick by brick, the company grew. 30 years. That's how long it took. 30 years of missed dinners of Sophia waiting by the window for me to come home. 30 years of saving every dollar, reinvesting, taking risks no one believed in. 30 years to go from a garage in Queens to skyscrapers in Manhattan. Alvarez Construction wasn't just a company, it was my life's testimony. 847 projects, 340 employees, millions in payroll, families fed homes, built communities lifted. That was my resume. That was my legacy. So when Nate Whitaker smirked across my kitchen table and suggested I should be grateful for a seat at table 12, my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. My silence carried the weight of decades. My silence was louder than his arrogance. I thought about Sophia, my daughter, my pride. I remembered the first day I held her tiny, fragile screaming with a voice that filled the hospital room. Her mother, God rest her soul, squeezed my hand and whispered, "Promise me she'll never know the hunger we knew." And I kept that promise. I worked myself raw so Sophia could have choices, so she could walk into any room, any school, any opportunity, and never feel small. When she graduated valedictorian from Fordham, cap and gown gleaming, I cried harder than I did the day I became a U.S. citizen. But here she was, engaged to a man who wanted to strip that history away. Nate wasn't just insulting me. He was teaching my daughter to be ashamed of the very sacrifices that built her future. That was the part that burned. I sat alone one night, staring at the framed photo of Sophia in her graduation robes. The mantle was cluttered with memories: her science fair ribbon, a baseball she caught at a Yankees game, her mother's wedding ring. All reminders of the road we had traveled together. And I asked myself, what do I gain by fighting with the Whitakers now? What do I gain by shouting, by demanding respect, by arguing for my worth? Nothing. Because men like them don't hear arguments. They only hear results. And I had results in spades. So I made a choice. I would not argue. I would not raise my voice. I would let them believe their performance. Let them smile their fake smiles. Let them place me by the kitchen doors. Let them polish their illusions of superiority. I would nod, I would smile, I would play the part of the quiet immigrant father too humble to fight back. Because silence gives you space to think. And while they believed they were winning, I was remembering. Remembering every handshake I had ever earned, every board member I had ever bailed out of a construction disaster, every family my company had housed, every judge who cut ribbons at buildings I had raised. 30 years of relationships, 30 years of favors owed, 30 years of leverage. Nate thought he was moving pieces on a chessboard. What he didn't know was that I had been building the board my entire life. The Whitakers believed they had cornered me. They believed their wealth and refinement made them untouchable. But my silence wasn't retreat, it was preparation. because I knew what was coming. I knew that someday, very soon, I'd have the chance to show them the difference between money you inherit and respect you earn. And when that day came, they wouldn't hear me argue. They wouldn't hear me shout. They'd hear only the sound of silence breaking louder than thunder, sharper than glass when the truth finally landed. There's a moment when betrayal shifts from pain to purpose. For weeks, I'd swallowed every insult with a smile, let them shuffle me toward the shadows, let Nate Whitaker tell me where I belonged. But the day I saw my name printed next to table 12 by the kitchen doors, I stopped being a father waiting for respect and became a builder preparing for demolition. And this demolition wasn't of brick and mortar, it was of illusions. I knew I couldn't face Nate alone. He had the Whitaker name, 4 generations of polished power, and a Rolodex of judges, lawyers, and senators ready to protect their own. But I had something stronger, 30 years of relationships forged in sweat, concrete, and integrity. And I had Daniel Ortiz. Daniel wasn't just a private investigator. He was a brother-in-arms, a man I met years ago when he left the Army, and I hired him as a security consultant for one of my high-rise projects. He had the sharpest instincts I'd ever seen, someone who could read lies in a man's posture before he opened his mouth. If anyone could uncover what Nate was hiding, it was Daniel. I called him on a Friday morning, my voice steady but burning inside. "Daniel, I need everything you can get me on Nathaniel Whitaker and his firm." He whistled. "The Whitakers? That's old money, Martin. You're poking at a hornet's nest." "Then let's see how much honey they've been stealing," I said. "You've got until 3 p.m. There's 10,000 in it if you deliver." Daniel didn't waste time. By mid-afternoon, he called back, his voice buzzing with adrenaline. "Martin, you won't believe this. Palmer Investment Group looks clean on the surface, but underneath it's a house of cards. The SEC has been investigating them for 8 months. Client funds misappropriated, $2.7 million gone. And your future son-in-law, he's sitting on nearly $400 million in gambling debt spread across 3 Atlantic City casinos." I sat back in my chair, the numbers hitting like steel beams. 2.7 million, 400,000. The man who dared to lecture me about refinement and status had been robbing retirees to feed blackjack tables. The irony was almost poetic, but I didn't stop at discovery. Truth without action is useless. I had to turn the evidence into impact. That's where my real power lay, not in shouting about who I was, but in showing them who they had underestimated. My first call was to Mrs. Chen at the Westchester Country Club. I reminded her of the $2 million renovation Alvarez Construction had delivered in 2019, when the original contractor abandoned the project. "There's been a family emergency," I explained softly. "The Whitaker-Alvarez wedding won't be happening here. Please process the cancellation." Within minutes, the $500 deposit was refunded. Then I dialed the Four Seasons Westchester. "Mr. Rodriguez," I said warmly, "remember that kitchen remodel in 2019, the one that came in under budget and 3 weeks ahead of schedule? I need a favor." That favor was simple: cancel Nate's backup booking of the presidential suite. A plumbing emergency suddenly rendered it unavailable. Deposit refunded. Next came Glen Island Harbor Club. Bill Patterson, the owner, owed me more than money. He owed me his reputation. In 2018, I rebuilt his marina after his previous contractor cut corners and left him facing lawsuits. "Bill," I said, "I need the Palmer wedding off your books. No questions, just trust me." His voice was hesitant, but he agreed. Another venue gone. By 2 p.m., 3 prime locations were erased. But I wasn't done. I spent the next 2 hours making calls one after another, each tied to a project Alvarez Construction had rescued over the years. Rye Golf Club, where we built a new clubhouse after a fire. Sleepy Hollow Country Club, where we renovated their pro shop around tournament season. Maritime Aquarium, where we installed HVAC systems that saved them $500,000 in energy costs. By 5 o'clock, 11 venues in Westchester and beyond had canceled on Nate. 11. Not a coincidence, not bad luck, but the ripple effect of 30 years of earned trust. That evening, my phone buzzed with Sophia's number. Her voice shook. "Dad, something's wrong. The planner just called Country Club canceled. Then Four Seasons, then Glen Island. Austin's freaking out. He says it's impossible. Venues don't just vanish like this." I bit my tongue, let her talk. "He thinks someone's sabotaging us," she said. "Maybe," I answered calmly. Or maybe it's just the universe evening the scales. Truth was, it wasn't the universe. It was me finally deciding not to be erased. But the cancellations were just the prelude. The real weapon was Daniel's file, 47 pages of bank records, SEC documents, client complaints, and casino receipts. Evidence so damning it didn't need embellishment. One transfer showed $180,000 stolen from an 82-year-old widow's retirement account. Another $240,000 siphoned from a couple's college fund for their grandson. Each page screamed betrayal louder than Nate ever accused me of not belonging. When I flipped through those pages, I felt a strange calm. For weeks I had carried anger like a weight, but now I didn't need anger. I had proof. Proof that the man who humiliated me in my own home was nothing but a thief in a silk tie. The Whitakers thought optics were everything. They thought appearances would save them. But optics crumble when the FBI shows up at your door. And that was the final piece of my plan. I called Agent Torres, a contact I'd helped years ago when Alvarez Construction rebuilt a federal annex after a storm. I explained what Daniel had uncovered. He listened, then said one line that told me everything I needed. "Thank you, Mr. Alvarez. We'll move up the timeline." The arrest had been scheduled for Monday. Now they would come Saturday, right on Nate's wedding day. I leaned back in my chair, closed Daniel's folder, and stared at the seating chart still pinned to my corkboard. My name, table 12 by the kitchen doors. I smiled. Let them think I was erased. Let them think I was small. Because tomorrow when the FBI walked into that wedding, everyone would learn the truth. The man they thought unimportant was the one holding all the power. Weddings are supposed to be about love, about family, about new beginnings. But on that Saturday afternoon, standing in the Alvarez family estate with 150 guests staring at me, I knew this wedding would be remembered for something else entirely. The day truth ripped through silken chandeliers. The day illusions collapsed in front of everyone. The air was thick with expectation. Guests in designer suits and gowns murmured as they settled on the back lawn, the Hudson River glinting behind them. Sophia, my daughter, still wore her white dress, but the veil was gone. Her eyes were red from hours of crying, yet steady now, sharp with clarity. She stood at the edge of the patio, microphone in hand, her voice trembling only at first. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I know you're confused. The last-minute changes, the canceled venues, the whispers, but today you deserve the truth." And that's when I stepped forward, folder in hand. A plain manila folder, but heavy with the weight of 47 pages bank records, SEC filings, testimonies of betrayal. Every step I took was measured, my boots sinking slightly into the soft lawn. I stopped in front of the crowd, met their eyes, and spoke not as a guest, not even as a father, but as a man whose silence had ended. 2 days ago, I said the man my daughter was supposed to marry told me only important people belonged at this wedding, that my friends, my co-workers, my family didn't matter, that our lives, our sacrifices didn't speak the so-called language of real power. The crowd shifted uneasily. Margaret Whitaker, Nate's mother, stiffened in her chair, pearls gleaming at her throat. Nate stood near the edge of the gathering, pale jaw, tight, his lawyer whispering something urgent in his ear. I opened the folder and held up the first page. This is Margaret Hoffman's retirement account. 82 years old, widowed. She trusted Palmer Investment Group with her life savings. $180,000 transferred to a casino account used by Nathaniel Whitaker. Gasps cut through the silence. I didn't stop. I flipped to the next page. Robert and Susan Chen, 50 years married, saved $240,000 for their grandson's college education. That money disappeared, replaced by poker chips at Borgata. I lifted the page high so every guest could see the federal letterhead. More gasps. A judge in the crowd leaned forward, squinting. Senator Caldwell shifted in his seat, suddenly uneasy. And it doesn't end there, I continued. 12 families, $2.7 million stolen, all funneled through Palmer Investment Group, all signed off by the man standing here today. Nate's lawyer barked. These are unverified documents. This is slander. I smiled and reached into my pocket. Unverified. Let's ask the man himself. I pulled out my phone, connected it to the portable speaker meant for wedding music, and pressed play. Nate's voice filled the garden, crisp and arrogant. The language of real power, Martin. Old money, established influence. There's a difference between new money and money refined over generations. The recording echoed, slicing through the summer air. Guests looked around, whispering, some covering their mouths in shock. I let the next part play. This marriage is Sophia's chance to elevate herself, to leave certain things behind. I stopped the recording and let the silence hang. Every eye was on Nate now. His polished mask had cracked. Sweat glistened at his temples. "You want to talk about real power?" I said, my voice firm, each word cutting clean. "Real power is the trust you earn, not the money you steal. Real power is building something from nothing, not inheriting a family name while you prey on the elderly. Real power is honesty." At that moment, a ripple moved through the crowd as 3 black SUVs rolled up the driveway. Doors opened and men in dark suits stepped out. Leading them was Agent Torres, calm, authoritative, carrying the weight of the law itself. He walked toward Nate, flashing his badge. "Nathaniel Whitaker, you are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and embezzlement." The guests erupted in chaos, shocked gasps, phones lifted to record whispers turning into shouts. Margaret Whitaker leapt to her feet. "This is outrageous. He's being framed." Torres ignored her, reading, "Nate, his rights." Nate tried to protest, but his voice cracked, his lawyer tugging at his sleeve. "You can't do this. Not here, not today." "Oh, yes, we can," Torres said coolly. "We've been building this case for 8 months. Your arrogance just sped up the timeline." The sight was surreal. Nate, once so smug about refined money and optics, standing in handcuffs as 150 guests looked on. Judges, senators, business leaders, all the important people he wanted at his wedding were now witnesses to his downfall. Sophia stepped closer, her voice stronger than ever. "You told me love meant leaving my history behind. But love doesn't erase. Love celebrates. And today the truth celebrates louder than any wedding vows." I looked at her, pride swelling in my chest. My daughter had found her strength not in his world of illusions, but in the truth of her roots. As the FBI led Nate away, the crowd parted. Some guests avoided eye contact, ashamed of the role they'd played in enabling the Whitakers. Others whispered apologies to Sophia to me, as if words could undo years of arrogance. Margaret Whitaker stood frozen, her son's downfall unfolding before her eyes. I caught her gaze and said, steady and unflinching, "You were right about one thing, Mrs. Whitaker. Some people never learn their place. Your son's place was as an honest man. He chose to be a criminal instead." She turned face pale and walked away without another word. The chaos slowly settled, but one truth remained clear. The Whitakers' world of polished lies had shattered, and in its ruins my silence had finally spoken louder than their power. The morning after the wedding that never was, the Westchester Journal-News carried a photo on the front page that said more than any headline could. There was Nate Whitaker, once so polished, being led in handcuffs by FBI agents. His Yale-class ring glinted under the flash of cameras, but the symbol of prestige looked like a shackle now. Beneath the photo, the headline screamed, "Investment banker charged in $2.7 million fraud against elderly clients." For years, the Whitakers had been the gold standard of Westchester society. They were the family invited to every gala, whose donations kept their names on museum wings and hospital walls the family people whispered about, as if their money had been blessed by history itself. But overnight, that illusion collapsed. It turns out old money burns just as quickly as dry timber when truth sets the fire. Within a week, prosecutors announced they were seeking a sentence of 8 to 12 years for Nate. In court, as victims testified, the picture grew even darker. Elderly men and women stood up trembling, recounting how they'd been convinced to trust him with their futures. A widow describing cat food dinners because her retirement had vanished. A grandfather choking back tears as he explained how his grandson lost his Harvard dreams to Nate's poker habit. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. When the verdict came, 9 years in federal prison with eligibility for release after 7, the courtroom didn't cheer. It sighed, a collective exhale from people who had been holding their breath for too long. Nate slumped in his suit, no longer the golden boy of the Whitaker dynasty, just another criminal waiting for prison gates to close. But prison was only the beginning. The real collapse happened outside the courtroom. The Whitaker name, once a crown, became a curse. Judges and senators who had toasted champagne in their living room cut ties overnight. Partners at Nate's father's law firm scrambled to distance themselves. Clients pulled accounts, donors withdrew checks, and suddenly the Whitakers weren't pillars of the community anymore. They were pariahs. The estate, once a gleaming testament to 4 generations of status, went up for sale. Whispers followed unpaid debts, frozen accounts, legal fees piling higher than the chandeliers in their ballroom. Evelyn tried to maintain the facade, attending luncheons, pretending nothing had changed, but people noticed the absence of pearls, the sudden disappearance of chauffeurs. Old money doesn't survive when its foundation is built on fraud. For me, the aftermath was quieter, but no less profound. The same neighbors who once pitied me for being the immigrant at table 12 now looked me in the eye with respect. At diners, strangers shook my hand. At job sites, workers nodded knowingly, proud that one of their own had stood against the arrogance of legacy. My silence, the one they mocked, had spoken louder than any speech. Sophia, though, carried the deepest scars. She had to face the reality that the man she loved never loved her. He loved what she represented, the access she could give him, but she also carried herself with courage. She went back to work at Alvarez Construction, this time not as a bystander, but as my partner. Her first decision was to establish a victim assistance fund for the 12 families Nate had robbed. We couldn't give them back their innocence, but we could give them back security. Watching her sign those checks, watching her choose to stand with the people Nate destroyed, I knew she was stronger than ever. The Whitakers never apologize. Pride runs too deep in families that cling to image. Evelyn sent one letter not to me but to Sophia, insisting that Nate had simply made poor financial choices and that time would heal his reputation. Sophia never answered. Some reputations can't be healed. Some names are meant to be buried with the truth. In the months that followed, I noticed something interesting. Invitations that once skipped my mailbox began to arrive. Business leaders wanted to meet, not out of pity, but respect. Reporters called hungry for the immigrant versus old money story, the classic American reversal. I declined most interviews. I didn't need more headlines. I had already made my point, because the true victory wasn't Nate in handcuffs or the Whitakers losing their estate. The true victory was this: my daughter no longer looked ashamed when she introduced me. She stood taller, prouder, knowing where she came from, knowing the price paid for every brick of her life. That pride mattered more than any verdict. 9 years. That was Nate's sentence. But the Whitakers' real punishment was something deeper: irrelevance. The people who once called them refined now crossed the street to avoid them. Their old money empire collapsed not with an explosion, but with silence, polite doors closed, phone calls unanswered, invitations vanished. They had measured my worth by their optics, and in the end, it was their optics that destroyed them. As for me, I kept building. Not just skyscrapers, but trust, dignity, legacy. Alvarez Construction thrived because it always stood for honesty, not optics. And in every foundation we poured in, every ribbon we cut, people saw more than steel and glass. They saw proof that respect is earned, not inherited. So when I drive past the Whitaker estate, now empty and overgrown, I don't feel triumph. I feel clarity. The story was never about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth is simple: old money can collapse in one night. Earned respect lasts forever. The weeks after Nate's sentencing felt strangely quiet. For so long, my life had been filled with the noise of his arrogance, the backhanded compliments, the whispered insults, the talk of optics and refined money. Now that noise was gone, replaced by silence that felt both heavy and healing. But silence also leaves room for reflection, and in that space, my daughter Sophia finally found her voice. It was a Sunday afternoon when she came to my house. No cameras, no lawyers, no Whitakers lurking in the shadows. Just her standing in the doorway, clutching a folder to her chest like it was a shield. Her eyes were red, but not from tears this time, from resolve. "Dad," she said softly, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." We sat at the same kitchen table where months earlier she had nervously defended Nate's decisions, where she had told me love requires adjustments. Now her voice trembled for different reasons. "I let him make me ashamed of you," she admitted, staring at her hands. "Every time he questioned our friends, our family, our history, I stayed quiet. I thought if I just went along, I could keep the peace. But silence isn't peace, it's surrender. And I surrendered the very thing I should have been most proud of you." Her words cut deeper than any Whitaker insult ever had. Because they came from the person I had sacrificed everything for, the person I had carried bricks for in 90-degree heat, the reason I had built Alvarez Construction from nothing. But as painful as it was, I knew her confession was also her liberation. I reached across the table, took her hand and said, "Sophia, love makes us blind sometimes. I don't blame you for wanting to believe in him. I blame him for teaching you to doubt where you came from." That broke her. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she whispered, "I want to make it right." And she did. The folder she carried wasn't just paperwork, it was the blueprint for a new beginning. Inside were plans for the Alvarez Victim Assistance Fund, a program to support the 12 families whose savings Nate had destroyed. "Dad," she said, "if Alvarez Construction could build towers and stadiums, why can't it build security for the people he stole from? We can't give them back their innocence, but we can give them back their lives." I studied the documents, the financial models, the outlines for community outreach. It wasn't just an idea, it was already in motion. Sophia had spoken with accountants, legal advisors, even victims themselves. And for the first time since the wedding debacle, I saw not the frightened girl trying to fit into someone else's world, but the woman her mother and I had raised, strong, compassionate, unafraid to stand with the people who needed her most. The first meeting with the victims happened in our conference room downtown. A dozen faces lined with exhaustion and grief sat across from us. Margaret Hoffman, the widow who'd lost her retirement. Robert and Susan Chen, whose grandson's college dreams had been stolen. Mary Rodriguez, who had lost her home after a stroke. They all carried pain like a second skin. Sophia stood at the head of the table, clutching her notes but speaking from the heart. "I can't undo what Nathaniel did to you. I can't erase the fear, the humiliation, or the betrayal. But I can promise you his actions will not define the rest of your lives. Alvarez Construction will stand with you. Not because it's charity, because it's justice." Her voice cracked, but her conviction didn't. She laid out the plan: emergency financial grants to stabilize housing and medical care, educational scholarships for the Chen grandson, a partnership with local nonprofits to provide counseling and legal aid. For every dollar Nate stole, we would give back double in rebuilding. The room, once filled with silence, began to shift. People leaned forward, some cried, some nodded slowly, the weight of despair lifting just enough to let hope back in. And as I watched Sophia speak, I realized this wasn't just about helping victims, it was about reclaiming her own dignity. From that day on, Sophia wasn't just my daughter, she became my partner. She took a position at Alvarez Construction as Director of Community Relations, a role she carved with her own hands. She managed the fund, coordinated with families, and built bridges where Nate had burned them. Every morning she walked into the office, not as the girl who once apologized for where she came from, but as the woman who now celebrated it. The ripple effect was powerful. Local newspapers covered the fund, calling it a reversal of fortunes. The same headlines that once painted us as new money immigrants now praised us as community builders. But more importantly, the families themselves carried the story forward. Mrs. Hoffman sent Sophia a handwritten note: "You restored my faith in people when I thought it was gone forever." Even in the quiet moments, the reconciliation continued. At dinner, Sophia would talk about the victims like they were extended family. She no longer spoke of optics or fitting in. She spoke about impact, about meaning, about legacy. The Whitakers had taught her to chase appearances. Now she was building something real. And though she never said the words directly, every action was an apology written in stone. Joining Alvarez Construction wasn't just a career choice. It was her way of saying, "Dad, I see you now. I see what you built, and I'm proud to stand with you." The Whitakers may have lost their reputation, their estate, their so-called refinement, but I gained something priceless: a daughter who no longer measured her worth by someone else's standards, but by her own. That was the reconciliation I needed, not shouted in public, but whispered in actions, in choices, in the way Sophia looked at me now, with pride instead of shame. And in that quiet, indirect way, we healed. When the noise finally faded, when the reporters stopped calling, and the Whitaker name sank beneath its own disgrace, life settled back into something simple. And honestly, that was all I ever wanted. Sophia and I found ourselves eating dinner at the same old kitchen table where this entire storm had begun. No chandeliers, no senators, no whispers about optics. Just takeout from the neighborhood diner, the hum of the fridge, and laughter that sounded lighter than it had in years. She no longer looked over her shoulder to see who was watching. She no longer apologized for who she was. She was free, and in that freedom, so was I. Work at Alvarez Construction continued steady as ever. Projects went up, employees got paid, families built lives from the foundations we laid. Sophia poured herself into the Victim Assistance Fund, shaking hands with people Nate had shattered, proving that justice doesn't end with a prison sentence, it begins with rebuilding. And every time I saw her at a ribbon cutting or handing a scholarship to a young student, I felt the kind of pride no old money family could ever understand. Because here's the truth I need you to carry with you. Earned power beats inherited privilege. Respect isn't written in a last name. It's built one relationship at a time. For 30 years, I carried bricks, built towers, and built trust. That trust stood when the Whitakers' so-called legacy collapsed in a single weekend. Maybe you felt it too, someone telling you that you don't belong, that your roots aren't good enough, that you should stay in your lane. Maybe you've stayed silent because fighting felt useless. But let me tell you, this silence doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes silence is strategy. And when the moment comes, your truth will roar louder than all their arrogance. So I'll leave you with this. Your worth isn't measured by the table they seat you at, it's measured by the lives you touch. If this story hits you somewhere deep, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Save this video if you need the reminder on hard days. And if you believe respect should always be earned, not inherited, hit subscribe because we've got more stories that prove it.